think we'll move along, but if you have further questions for James, please hold on to them, and hopefully at the end we can have further discussion. Our third speaker in the panel today is Vanessa Baaba Dadzie. I heard you referred to by the name Baba by James, so I'm not sure, but we're great. We're so happy to have you here. And you're a PhD student at the University of Waterloo, Canada. And Vanessa, or Baba, the title of your presentation is Exploring Differences in the Relationship Between Boredom, Proneness, and the Feeling and Judgment of Agency. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John. Just a minute. I'm trying to share my presentation for having me here. Thanks for the introduction, John. It's a pleasure to be here, a good opportunity for me to present my work. I think this is a great event, and I'd like to commend the organizers for putting it together. So as you know, Dr. James Danckert, who's just finished his presentation, is my supervisor, and it's not at all daunting to present right after your supervisor, right? So there's a part of me that feels like I have big shoes to fill, but I can imagine it will be okay. So today I'll be presenting work that has looked at the differences in the relationship between boredom and the feeling and judgment of agency. So that feeling or sense that a person is in control of their lives, and the judgment of agency that is ascribed to self, but also to actors and events that are external to the self. And as I continue my presentation, this distinction that I just made will become clearer. Next, please. So I was very tempted not to include a definition of boredom in my presentation because I anticipated hearing different definitions of boredom. But as you can see on my slide now, I caved and put a definition up for two reasons. One, because I can genuinely say that it's become my favorite definition of boredom. But more than that, I think it really captures the difficult experience that boredom is. And it's one by Leo Tolstoy, where he defines boredom as a desire for desires. So when we're bored, we want something. We want to engage with the world around us, but we don't want to engage with anything that's immediately available. So coming back to this definition, we have that desire to engage, but we're unable to meet that desire with anything that's currently available to us. And in that moment, or during the period when we struggle to engage, we may, we don't think of ourselves as being effective agents. So we've looked at this relationship between boredom and agency in a self-regulatory framework. So again, as I go along, this framework will become clearer, but we basically looked at it in the context of self-control, which we know that people who are high in boredom proneness usually have low levels of. And we've also looked at it within the context of the regulatory mode, and I'll share that as I go along. Next, please. So this is a real-life example of how important the need for agency is. So you might not know this, but the buttons at most of the crosswalks in New York City are useless, right? They don't make a difference. The lights will change at predetermined times. And yet, these buttons have been put there such that when people push them, they have this sense of control, right? This sense of agency in the moment when they push the buttons. And I can almost bet that even now that I've said this to you, the next time you are at the crosswalk, you will push the buttons too. And you know what? That's really okay, because it feels good to have this sense that you have some control in your external world. Next, please. Here's another picture that I've come to like, and that's because it reminds me of an experience that I imagine most, if not all, of the parents here will find familiar. And that's the experience of a young child who walks up to their parent and exclaims, "I'm bored." Now, what the child is really saying to the parent is this: "I'm bored, and I want you to fix it for me." And yet, when the parent goes ahead to, suggest activity options for the child refuses. "No, I don't want to color. I don't want to play outside. I certainly don't want to learn how to spell." And so I'm going to take you back to our definition. Here, the child wants to engage. The child wants the parents to be their agent, but the child goes ahead to dismiss every activity option that is proposed by the parent. And so here we find that need for agency in the throes of boredom is very important. Next, please. So what evidence might there be for this relationship between boredom and agency that I speak of? So there's some indirect evidence that I'm going to walk you through. So in our lab and in other labs, we've established a negative relationship between boredom proneness and self-control. So as you can see on my screen, you find that people who are high in boredom proneness tend to have low levels of self-control. Now you can imagine that a high degree of self-control is important for agency, right? So the more in control you feel, the more of an effective agent you think of yourself as being, right? Conversely, people who have people who are high in boredom proneness and have low levels of self-control usually don't think of themselves as being effective agents. Next, please. And then there's the regulatory mode. So this was proposed by Kruglanski and his colleagues, and these are two distinct approaches to goal pursuit. Now, the first is the just do it or the locomotion mode. The second is the do the right thing or assessment mode. People who tend to adopt the locomotion mode tend to move from one action state to the next fairly rapidly and consistently. On the other hand, people who adopt the assessment focus are usually, stuck ruminating over available options for action, just making sure they make the right choice, right? And being careful not to make any mistakes. Now, if we come back to the locomotion focus, what we see is a negative relationship between boredom proneness and locomotion. So this says to us that people who are high in boredom proneness tend to not move from one action state to the next, right? They're usually stuck ruminating over options, making sure that they make the best choice or decision, as is characteristic of the assessment mode. And so this is what that state of feeling stuck is what we and others have called the failure to launch. Now, again, when we are in that moment of being stuck and being unable to move from action state to the next, we might code that as, or we are likely to code that as ineffective agency. On the other hand, if we're moving from one action state to the next, we think of ourselves as being effective agents. And so here we see that people who are high in boredom proneness tend to not think of themselves as being effective agents. Next, please. So I've just shared some indirect evidence of the relationship between boredom and agency. Now here's some direct evidence that I'm going to walk you through. And this is from a PhD thesis by Lauren Kahn. This was presented in 2018. And in Kahn's experimental task, participants were presented with a screen that had several black squares that were in random motion and one white square that would move in response to the participant's button press. And participants were required to make at least 10 movements during every 30-second trial. Now, in some trials of this task, a delay was introduced between the participant's button press and the eventual movement of the square on the screen. And what Kahn found was that in trials where a delay was introduced, participants reported feeling a decrease in their sense of agency. And so we can tell from this that we're able to manipulate a participant's sense of agency when we introduce delays of varying lengths, right? So longer delays will translate into more significant drops in a participant's sense of agency. Now, how might all of this relate to boredom? Next, please. Sorry, I thought I was moving that. Okay, so here we find that as participants reported decreases in their sense of agency, they also reported increases in the boredom experience, the levels of boredom experience, right? So we find that there's a negative relationship between the sense of agency and state boredom. Next, please. Thank you. So more recently, Gorelick and Eastwood have put forward the idea that agency is an important framework for conceptualizing all the psychological factors that have been associated with both state and trait boredom. And so they've gone ahead to test the relationship using self-report measures of the sense of agency and of trait boredom proneness. And what they found was a moderate negative relationship between the two constructs. So basically, people who are high in boredom proneness tend to have diminished levels of agency. Next, please. So the first study that I'm going to present to you replicates the findings of Gorelick and Eastwood, but we go beyond that. We extend that and look at agency in the context of self-regulation. So first, in the context of self-control, which I've already spoken of, and also the regulatory mode, which I've already mentioned. The one other thing that we include is self-efficacy, which is a measure of how confident you are in the ability to achieve the things you set out to achieve, right? And we have past work from our lab showing that people who are high in boredom proneness tend to have low levels of self-efficacy. And so we included it in our work because we believe it will give us a well-rounded understanding of agency, especially as it relates to boredom. Next, please. So for our first study, we asked participants to complete five self-report measures. The first of which was a short boredom proneness scale for obvious reasons. We then assessed self-control, which is that idea of being able to marshal your thoughts, your feelings, or your emotions and your actions towards the pursuit of your goals. And then we had the regulatory mode, those two distinct approaches to goal pursuit that I spoke to you about. We had the assessment mode and the locomotion mode. And if you remember the distinction we made, you probably would have picked up that the question we have here is specific to the locomotion mode. And then we assessed self-efficacy, which I've just mentioned, that idea of being confident in your ability to pursue what you set out to achieve or to achieve. And then finally, we use the same scale that Gorelick and Eastwood used. So the sense of agency scale that gives us a measure of how much in control a person feels they are in their lives, or how much of an author they think they are of their lives. Next, please. So we established zero-order correlations with our measures and basically replicated what Gorelick and Eastwood found. So we found that boredom proneness and the sense of agency were moderately negatively correlated. So this says to us that people who are high in boredom proneness tend to have diminished levels of agency. And we found this across two samples. Next, please. So it turns out that the sense of agency scale was constructed with two subscales. So we have the positive sense of agency and the negative sense of agency. Now, the positive sense of agency communicates the idea that a person is in control of their lives. And the negative sense of agency, as you can imagine, communicates the idea that a person has little control in their lives. Now, we made this distinction because the negative sense of agency has been referenced as underlying some mental health problems like depression, anxiety, and even obsessive compulsive disorder. And as you know, boredom proneness has also been associated with a raft of mental health problems. And so separating them and looking at their individual relationships with boredom proneness gave us a better understanding, right, generally of the relationship between boredom proneness and agency. So here we find that the positive sense of agency is negatively correlated with boredom proneness. Negative agency is also positively, or on the other hand, is positively correlated with boredom proneness. And when we compared their individual correlations with boredom proneness, we found that the relationship with negative agency, that is between boredom proneness and negative agency, was stronger. Next, please. So we basically replicated the relationship between boredom proneness, self-control, the regulatory mode, and the sense of agency. Now, once we had done that, we ran a stepwise regression for both samples, where we found that self-efficacy explained some amount of variance in boredom proneness, but it was a small amount of variance, just about 1%. And when we included the sense of agency, we found that it explained about 4% of variance in our regression model, which says to us that it's an important contributor to that individual trait of boredom. And so once we had done this, we went ahead to explore what the relationship between the perception of agency and boredom was. Next, please. So here we were interested in finding out whether or not in the moment feelings of boredom would influence your perceptual judgments of agency. We had no a priori hypotheses for boredom proneness, but we still went ahead to test it. And so for this task, we use, for this study, we use a classic task from the 1940s by Heider and Simmel. It's an animation that I'm sure you've seen at some point in your Psych 101 classes or at some point in your psychology career. And if you haven't, this is a good opportunity for you to watch it. So please move to the next slide. So this is could you please let it play? So this is a 90-second animation. It has 3 geometric shapes moving around on the screen. Of course, these are inanimate shapes, but they give off the impression of having agency. So you have a big triangle, a relatively smaller triangle, and a circle interacting at different points. Looks like the 2 triangles are playing, although it looks like a bit of rough play. The big triangle looks very much like a bully, pushing the small triangle to a corner. The circle looks like it's just keeping itself at a safe distance. Okay, gets into what we think of as the house and closest to the door. Okay, big triangle looks like it's coming after the circle. Circle still keeping its distance, trying to be strategic, moving around the big triangle. Looks like the small triangle came to the circle's rescue. Okay, they do a bit of a happy dance, a hug maybe. Now they're trying to elude the big triangle, who's in hot pursuit of the two smaller shapes. And then the 2 smaller shapes disappear, leaving the big triangle confused, upset maybe. Okay, slams the door, opens it, slams the door again, breaks the window, breaks the roof, and it looks like the whole house comes apart. And then the video comes to a close. Next slide, please. And so once participants watch this animation, we ask them to respond to 10 questions that assess their perceptual judgments of agency as a function of the video, the animation they've just watched. And once they respond to those questions, we run 0-order correlations where we find that indeed, in the moment, feelings of boredom are negatively correlated with perceptual judgments of agency. So that says to us that when you are bored in the moment, or the more bored you are in the moment, the less agency you see. In this case, the less agency the participants saw in the triangles and circle that were moving on the screen. And so we went ahead to run a second regression for this. We ran a regression for this study where we found that boredom proneness had no influence on a participant's capacity to judge agency, right? Which was in itself interesting for us to find, because if you remember from our first study, we mentioned that people who were high in boredom proneness had low levels of the sense of agency. However, I guess what we understand from here is that is self-focused, right? That's internal and has no impact or influence on their capacity to perceive agency in the external world. And then when we go ahead to include a measure of state boredom, we find that it explains almost 20% of variance in perceptual judgments of agency. So what do we know about boredom and agency from our 2 studies? Next slide, please. So the first and perhaps most important thing is our replication of Gorelick and Eastwood. And that's the idea that the highly boredom prone tend to have a diminished sense of agency. So being high in boredom proneness means that you usually have or feel a low sense of agency. The second is that the negative sense of agency, if you remember that distinction we made between the 2 subscales, we believe that the negative sense of agency may account for the difficulties that people who are high in boredom prone experience when they struggle to launch, when they're experiencing that failure to launch. We believe the negative sense of agency underlies this experience. Unfortunately, we don't have any data to back what we're saying right now, but it's definitely something interesting and worth perhaps exploring in subsequent studies. And then finally, we find from our second study that the more bored you are in the moment, the less agency you ascribe externally. In the case of the study, it was ascribing less agency to the shapes, but we believe that this can be extended into real-world environments where being bored in the moment means you see less agency in actors and events that are external to yourself. Next slide. So I'd like to say this is the end of the presentation of my work. I'd like to say a big thank you to my supervisor and my lab mates who've been very supportive with my work. And yeah, I'd like to open it up now for questions that I will do my best to address.
Thank you so much, Baaba. It's wonderful. We indeed have time for questions. So please put a question in the chat or unmute yourself, and you can direct your question directly to Baaba if you wish.
Okay.
Carrie has her hand raised. Do you have a question for Baaba?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, Carrie, I can hear you.
That's not my only question, but anyway, hi. I'm wondering this. I really don't know how you would know this or be able to prove this or anything, but is there a possibility that lack of agency is a cause of boredom proneness? Or, I mean, like, what do we have an understanding of what the relationship between agency and boredom proneness is? Does one cause the other? Does boredom present, or they just happen to both exist?
Well, so our studies are correlational, so we don't say anything about causation, but we just based on ongoing work we're doing, we know that people who are high in boredom prone just have high in boredom proneness, pardon me, have a difficult time or struggle with prospective agency, right? They usually, okay, how do I put this? So they usually struggle to launch because they don't have that prospective agency. They don't believe that they're able to achieve their goals. And since they fail to launch, they're not able to achieve that retrospective agency that keeps that cycle of, or that helps build on their sense of agency, right? So we think it's a bi-directional relationship. It's not one that we've responded to with certainty, but yeah, I'm not sure if that speaks to your question.
I don't think that we know the answer to it, but I just was curious about it. Anyway, great presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I couldn't answer that a bit more definitively.
Maybe I'll ask a question while we're just waiting to see if there's others. Yeah, great presentation, Baaba. Thank you. Just a comment. I liked that you looked at both the positive and negative agency. I think that's important and something that I'm glad you did. My question, though, is regarding your final study. I'm just curious at this point if you have any speculations, and I know it would be speculating. So, you know, feel free to just let your imagination run wild. I'm just wondering, you know, why do you think people that were high in state boredom attributed less agency to these objects as they were dancing around on the screen? Just wondering if you have any preliminary ideas about that, or if you were to follow up on this work, what you would recommend that researchers look at as a possible explanation.
Okay, thank you, John. So, like you've said, we're not sure why that is, but one of the things we've thought about is that perhaps people, our participants, perhaps weren't paying attention, right? We consider the fact that if people weren't paying attention, you know, chances were high that they would see less agency in the shapes. And I mean, one thing that we didn't do, we understand that if you are bored, you know, chances are that you are mind wandering or that you are not paying attention. But one thing we've discussed is perhaps to control for mind wandering, right? Perhaps be sure whether or not people are attending, right? And maybe that could speak to our question, that could answer our question of whether or not attention played a role in why people saw less agency in the shapes.
I'm interested in your thoughts, John. I mean, it is a puzzling kind of thing why my boredom should ascribe less agency to you, to something external to the self. You know, you might have thought that the highly boredom prone might sort of, you know, an individual who's highly boredom prone might sort of feel like they lack agency themselves, and so they might see agency in everything else. But, you know, Baaba could speak to the fact that we had an anthropomorphism scale in there too that had no real relationship to this, right? So it wasn't as though you were seeing agency everywhere, but the flip side of being bored in the moment and then sort of just ascribing a diminished agency to the world around you is quite puzzling.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I'm not sure how much I have to add. I mean, I guess, first of all, as Baaba said, ruling out I guess what you're considering a confound, right? That it's not the boredom per se, but the lack of attention to the stimuli. I think that's how you were thinking about that. But if you can demonstrate that people were equally attending to the stimuli and equally processing it, and that can't account for the difference, I don't know, but one off the top speculation would be that, a bored person may be less inclined to engage with the activity and maybe feeling that things are more meaningless. We've heard about meaning here earlier. And so there may be less attempt to try to structure or make sense of one's experience. And some research that we have not published yet shows that when people are bored, their motivation to sort of engage with the world or to make sense of what's happening is compromised in some way. And still figuring out how to square that with Vinand's work and the idea that a bored person wants to find meaning. But I think if you look at it temporally over a time scale, as Sandy Mann pointed out, or no, it was Aaron pointed out the need to look at how these things dynamically change over time. I think that would be something that I would do in this project too. But I'll stop talking and see if there's any other questions. We have a couple more moments and then we'll move on to our final presenter. So Carrie had asked a question. Carrie, I think the effect that we're talking about now was for state boredom. Baaba, do you want to address Carrie's question there? And it happens in state boredom too, right? Or am I misunderstanding?
Oh, I didn't see that. Is that in the chat now?
No.
Yes.
It's okay. Sorry. Your question, because I was clarifying your question, John, because you were asking a question about state boredom, not trait boredom, right? That like even people who are experiencing state boredom are ascribing less agency to others, which is interesting to me. Like it makes a little more sense to me in trait boredom, but even in state boredom, it's happening. Am I understanding that?
Yeah, my comment was based on trying to explain Baaba's findings with state boredom.
Yeah,
so
that's very interesting.
So Baaba, great job. You've stimulated lots of thought, and there's a whole lifetime of work there to deconstruct this and figure out what's going on. So thank you.